Welcome to System and Soul, the podcast focused on the human energy that runs your business. I'm Chris White, along with my co-host,
Benj Miller.
All right, you guys ready? Here we go. Jake, drop that beat.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Welcome, everybody. We've got an awesome conversation today. We have Tim Spiker, author of the book, The Only Leaders Worth Following, one of the most important books that helped shape what System and Soul is today for our clients. We're talking about how we spend our time, energy, and money in leadership development. We're talking about having a consistent leadership narrative and the idea of going first. I think you'll enjoy. Tim, we are pumped to have you here with us. We've talked about you before. We've talked about your book before. So before we get into all that, start us off with something super random and interesting about Tim Spiker.
Okay. I once had to hitchhike from the Taj Mahal to Delhi at night, in the middle of the night, and it also involved somebody hot wiring a car.
All right, you can't leave us there.
As Bill Murray would say, I want to party with you.
That sounds like the punchline. What's the setup?
The setup is I was on a basketball tour in India, and we had a day off, so we went to the Taj Mahal. And late in the day, well after dark, our bus broke down in the middle of nowhere in India, which will get your attention. We decided we were going to split the team up into groups of 3s and 4s as cars came by on this rural Indian road to try to get people back to India. And a good part of this story that I didn't even mention in that lead-in is that the first bus that pulled up, our translator talked with him, waved the bus on. And we're like, what are you doing? We could have gotten a couple of guys on that bus. And he said, no, the driver was drunk. So so thankfully he waved them on. But then in groups of, 3 or 4, we just started getting on various buses that were going the direction toward Delhi. The whole team split up. We ended up at a bus station. I mean, if anybody's ever been to India, the sights and smells of India are remarkable, life-changing. We got a taxi cab from the bus station back to our hotel and piled in a bunch of American basketball players. It looked like a clown car that we were on there. I was probably the smallest of everybody, but we were all still sardines in there. And somebody said, what is the driver doing? And because we'd had the most unbelievable trip, it didn't seem odd at all for me to turn to the back of them and say, he's hot wiring the car. And so he hot wired the taxi cab. I don't know whose cab it was. Maybe that's just how he started it every time. But hours and hours and hours later, somebody was throwing up on the bus that we were taking kind of back that we hopped. I mean, it was one crazy night. Everybody made it back to the hotel. Clearly, God was with us. So that's my story.
That sounds like some of the leadership teams I get to work with. One guy's hot wiring the car. One guy's drunk. We're not sure where one guy is at the moment.
Good thing the prison bus didn't come by. Yeah, we'll give you a lift.
Yes. So I'm thankful. All that means is I'm very thankful to be with you here today. It could have turned out differently.
It could have ended right there. Tim,
right.
we have a deep appreciation for you and your work, like we've talked about before, just in the work with the 2 attributes that makes an incredible leader. And thank you for being so open-handed with that and letting us use that in our work. So, Tim, we're excited to have you as our very first guest on what we're calling season 5 of this podcast, as we've been through a few iterations. But as we gave you a heads up, here's our new format. We want to talk about the top 3 things that are on your mind today as you're navigating your work, working with leaders around this country. What are you seeing? What are you thinking about it? What are your top 3 things?
All right. The first one is actually 3 words together: time, energy, and money. The second one, by chance, is also 3 words: consistent leadership narrative. And the third one is go first.
All right. I think you're sure you're not working like 8 things into this, right?
I promise. Yes.
Okay.
I promise.
All right. Time, energy, and money. What are you thinking about?
So you guys know what the data says, that 77%, or if we want to round it a little bit, 3/4 of your effectiveness as a leader comes from who you are, not what you do. And these 2 big important things that make up who we are, that being inwardly sound and others focused. So it's one thing to say the research points to this, and we can unpack all the reasons why that may be. But the thing that I want to spend a little time hearing from you guys about and talking about here is the idea is that if that's true, and I believe unquestionably it is for a variety of reasons, including the research, then the 3 words that I mentioned were time, energy, and money. I would suggest to anybody listening that we need to be spending 3/4 of our development, time, energy, and money, on becoming more inwardly sound and others focused. And yet, when I look at the landscape, exactly 0% of organizations are doing that. And there might be a few leaders who are doing it of their own volition, which I applaud them, but no organizations are taking that 3/4 approach. And I think for the ones that will have the guts to step up and do that, 5 to 10 years, it will be an incredible picture if they are starting to make that kind of investment. But it takes all 3: time, energy, and money. So that's my opening statement on that one. What are your guys' thoughts?
Super interesting. So I can see how I just personally, maybe not organizationally, but have started to prioritize all 3 of those in some form around that. And we could talk about how I'm doing that. But I'm curious how you're seeing organizations invest in that, because it feels like a good idea, but it could also feel really hard or almost invasive. Like we don't want to get into people's space too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're starting to dip their toe in on this idea of who, not what, and say, okay, we're going to run a couple of groups through this idea. We're going to spend some time digging into inwardly sound and others focus. But when you step back and look at the landscape of all of their intentional leadership development, you don't see that ratio there. So it could be that some of the concept is just kind of, even though this is what we hear. We hear that it's brand new, and I've known it my entire life. That's like true simultaneously. So I think perhaps over time, people will start to get a little bit more towards a more systematic approach to developing people and who they are, and really sound and others focus. But right now, they're trying it out, is what I've observed.
Jim, dude, when I think about 3/4 of my focus is on time, energy, and money. And I'm wondering if you can just take us a little deeper there, right? Like first blush, I get it. The 3/4, like, am I spending 3/4 of my time in those areas? I don't know. But to become inwardly sound, right? This is where what I'm hearing. Hey, if 3/4 of your time or focus is on inwardly sound, is there a correlation? Like, so when you separate time and energy, time, I get it. There's 24 hours in a day. Great. Energy. Talk to us about the energy part, because I don't want to. I have a thought, but I don't want to make an assumption. But what are you referring to when you say energy?
Well, can I clarify? Is it 75% of your time, energy, and money, or 75% of the time, energy, and money we would put into leadership development we should be prioritizing toward inwardly sound and others focus?
What you just said, Benj. That's what I'm talking about. When we think about, I want to become a better leader, and I want to do it intentionally and purposely. I want to do it not by happenstance, but very, very much on purpose. Then I'm going to invest some portion of my time, energy, and money in becoming a more well-developed leader. And what I'm talking about is goes beyond just getting the job done. Everybody gets the job done at a certain level. The question is, what am I doing beyond just the natural course of getting the job done that's going to help me get better? Of that portion, of that intentional portion, where you could take a class on this or hire a coach for that or read a book on this, watch a TED talk, put all of that together. And the research suggests that 3/4 of that time, energy, and money should go towards becoming a more well-developed becoming more inwardly sound and others focused of your development time, energy, and money. Okay.
So what's the first 10%? If an organization's at zero, which sounds like your experience says most of them are, right? What's the what is the first best step? Like, how do people get started?
I don't know if there is a first best step, but I would say the portion that most organizations have just a little bit of toe in the water, although it's not usually because of any of this research, is the whole battery of assessments that exists to help us become more self-aware. Self-awareness is a big part of being inwardly sound. It's far from the only thing, but it is a big part. And most organizations have some type of, whether it's DISC or MBTI or Enneagram or 360s, they have some version, especially as you go up the chain of command in the organization, some type of feedback mechanism that's going to help you take a step in self-awareness. And that's great. That's good. There are so many different assessments out there that are very valuable. I don't have a dog in the hunt on one being significantly better than the others. But most organizations are doing something like that. But when I think about the other, let me just read off a few other aspects of inwardly sound. And you can tell me whether you see organizations that are making a strident effort to move in this direction. Number one is principled. Are we doing any work in our organizations to become more principled? And I know that the next question is, well, what does that mean? And we might have a sense, but I'm just going to say courageous, honest, authentic, having integrity, and having grit. And what I see with our clients is, all those 5 words, these 5 things create a principled person. Everybody nods their head, and everybody says, well, that's pretty simple, until you start to work on it. Until you start to work on it, and you think about the definition that we use for integrity is doing what I say I will and proactively admitting what I don't. And now it starts to get interesting, because in that definition is embedded the idea that none of us has a perfect follow-through ratio. So what does it mean to get out ahead of it and own it before somebody else finds it? What does that do to the integrity? And then we get into these conversations with people about, well, what if I drop the ball every single time, but I tell them ahead of time every single time? And I was like, well, okay, let's talk about that. You may have a competency issue, not an integrity issue. That's a different conversation. But ultimately, principled is the umbrella we're talking about here. What are organizations doing? Not lip service, but real, like down to the heart. What are they doing to help their leaders be more courageous? We could stop there, because that's such an incredibly valuable tool for a leader to be courageous. What does it mean to step into those difficult conversations? What does it mean to step into your own fear as a leader? Because courage doesn't exist without fear. If you have zero fear, then you're not courageous, you're pathological. And so that's a different conversation. But my point is, in any one of these 5 things I just mentioned under principled, there's a deep dive that gets into the gray and difficulty pretty quickly. When when I mentioned principle, a holistically healthy. Now that's getting a little more play these days, but there's many aspects to it. It's not just physical health, and it's not just mental health. Let me say a crazy thing here. Financial health is a part of being holistically healthy. When we look at 8 aspects of life, financial is one of them. If I have leaders in my organization, and we can look at all the statistics around consumer debt and begin to kind of understand what is happening, at least in this Western society, around that. But if you are living under the yoke of debt, constantly spending more than you have, let's not fool ourselves about what that's going to do to our stress levels, long-term cortisol levels. All of that comes into play. And so now I know more and more. I saw one just the other day. An organization says, actually, it was this morning I saw it. I saw somebody saying, hey, we are proactively bringing to our organization financial literacy development because we want that type of help. So kudos to them. But there's a number of different things around holistic living. We're seeing a little bit more of that. Here's a couple other ones. Purposeful, which is not about the company's purpose. It's about your individual purpose as a person. What kind of organizations are saying our leaders are going to be more effective if they're showing up here every day, not just focused on organizational mission, but really clear on what they're personally doing with their lives and how does this job fit into that. I don't really find any organizations, frankly, that are proactively doing that. And then the last one that I'll mention here is probably the scariest and most complex at all. And it also, relatively speaking, gets a 0 on the investment level and would be a 10 out of 10 on its impact if we were to do it. And that is, what does it mean to be a secure and settled leader? Which is just, if you want to think about it, it's the opposite of being insecure. So I want to know how many organizations are developing experiences to help their leaders be less insecure, more settled in who they are, more confident in who they are, not inflated, not pretending, but I see the real story about me and I'm more secure because I'm telling you what, insecurity is a leadership destroyer. And almost nobody is dealing with it. So I know I rambled through a bunch of different stuff there, but my point is precious little of what it means to be inwardly sound is systematically being vested in by organizations.
Man, I'm a little bit encouraged because I think several of these System and Soul is ushering these conversations into the workplace.
Yeah.
Especially on the principled. The purposeful is interesting because as we teach the organization how to be purposeful, we're putting tools in their hand, and not every leader will pick them up, but now they have the tools to take those home for themselves, for their families. And Chris White and I talk all the time about the secure and settled because as a facilitator in the room, as a coach in the room, we can see it. How people respond to certain issues. Like if you're the number one indicator, right? If they're defensive, like it's an absolute shutdown. The energy goes down, the trust goes down, the vulnerability in the room goes down. And the antidote for that defensiveness in my mind is being secure and settled. And but man, that's hard for a facilitator or coach to come in, and that's a long journey, right? It takes a lot of work.
When you were telling us your description, I landed on the word courage that you used because, funny enough, this year in 22, I'm giving my clients this book.
Oh, great!
Yeah, and I'm holding up "Courage Is Calling" by Ryan Holiday. So he's probably one of the youngest, most foremost Stoic interpreters, if you will. He writes several books, but the courage part, after the last 2 years. And the year we're going into, right? The pandemic's not gone, right? And so, leaders, their confidence has been hurt a little, right? Maybe they're watching their profits dwindle away. People are leaving, what have you, all of that. And the courage to persevere through that. Yeah. We know we've got the right product. We know we're in the right market. We've got a good reputation. Yeah, we've taken some hits, but the leaders really do. They got to demonstrate courage, and the only way they're going to do that is if you link it right back up to being inwardly sound. The way that you brought it down, and that's a big one because look, especially men. Oh, we're good. Everything's great. We want to be strong. We never want to show any weaknesses. But then we get behind closed doors and we're like, holy crap, we just and to that point, I'll pull it to this last point because what Benjamin's talking about. That happens all the time in the room, and we, like Ben said, it's physically manifested in the room, multiple different ways, different people, and then we have to have the courage to step in, right? Yeah. And so, and that's that's not easy for a leader in that situation who maybe has had some success, but now they're beaten a little bit, their confidence, their courage is down. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have others that have done well. But that's what that really hit me about that, because, as you know, I just love the book. I love the teachings, the principles. I love how you go into depth on the 4 bullets for each one. And yeah, this is so new, because back in the day, nobody talked soft skills. My dad never talked soft skills in his businesses with us. Mm-hmm. Do it this way. I don't want to hear anything. Or mm-hmm. if I walked in on my dad, when he was doing the books, he closed the book. It's just, it was dictatorship, right? Yeah. And as I have evolved my coaching practice and, got 12 years, I haven't hit my 10,000 hours yet. I'm getting close. But I really, I'm just going to anchor it back to courage. We have to reinforce that with our clients. Like, listen, you made it this far. You're doing it. You got to have the grit. I think that was another word, that you used as a descriptor. And, if you haven't read Angela Duckworth, read it. But yeah, that's kind of where I landed on that. And I'm every time I share some of this, I share the book, or I share, hey, you might want to go check this out. But I give them the answers, like the 2 answers, and they're like,
"It's good,
Chris. What is this inwardly sound stuff?" I'm like, I know. Don't freak out. I'm telling you, it's gold. So anyway, I'm kind of pontificating, but.
I was gonna hold up the book and plug it, but I think I gave away all 3 of my copies. The book we keep referencing is Tim Spiker's the Only Leaders Worth Following, and we'll put that in the show notes. I think we could fill a whole episode talking about this idea of inwardly sound, and Chris White and I often do. But take us to your number 2 here. Your thought about consistent leadership.
All right. I want to say one thing to follow up to what Chris just said, if I could, and then we'll jump over to. You see the interplay on these things, and it gets really interesting, because as we talk about courage, and you have people that are leaders that are doing courageous things in organizations, and you think about the role that being secure and settled plays in courage, especially the settled part, because our friend John Ott, I quoted him in the book where he says, the person who's secure and settled says, I'm okay, and come what may, I'm okay. Now that is, for those of you, that is John Ott. He is so good with words. He comes up with stuff like that. The second half of that is aimed at the word, what does it mean to be settled? Come what may, I'm okay. When I'm a leader, that's more about what's coming at me from the outside. So let's say that my courageous, I stand up to the CEO at a time when I think he or she is making a bad decision. And I say, you know what? I think that now come what may, I'm okay. If he or she agrees with me, I'm okay. If he or she kicks me out of the room, I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. So it's the courage there's this linkage, I think, between being inwardly sound and others focused and our ability to be courageous. It doesn't mean that we don't have fears. It means that when we're more when we're more secure and settled, it allows us, it enables us to be more courageous. Here's the thing I think about, though, as we move up, we use a tree as the analogy, and this is who is below ground. But I want you to think about the cultivation of talent. Imagine I'm that department head who does stand up to the CEO, and let's say it turns out to be a really good story for the organization. If I go to the people, think about the leaders I'm developing. If I don't have the courage to be vulnerable with them and say, I was scared to do that. That was hard to do. Well, they just see the end result and they're like, oh, no problem for him. No problem. He just stepped in there and do that. And now I'm missing an opportunity. What if I'm going to develop somebody? And you talked earlier, like, well, wait a second. Are we going to really talk about this stuff? Well, only if we want to have great leaders is the answer to that one. So for me to be able to go to the people I'm developing and say, that was scary for me. And I stepped into it and I did it anyway. I had to practice being courageous. It feeds on itself versus me just kind of, shaking the dust off my shoulder and saying, yeah, I did that. Like, we have to develop the leaders that are coming behind us in these ways. And we can't do that if we don't have some of the vulnerability that allows us to say, for example, in this example, hey, that was a hard thing for me. That was a scary thing for me. But I decided it was in the best interest of the organization, and so I stepped into it. And man, if I see my leader telling me that he or she had to be courageous in the executive committee room, then I know that there's, hey, what if we're talking about every quarter, where are the opportunities to be courageous? What if that's part of our ongoing conversation about becoming a great leader? I tell people all the time, if you want to have world-class leadership in your organizations, you have to have world-class conversations about leadership. And if you're not willing to talk about who, then you're not going to be able to have world-class conversations.
I am so glad.
Sorry, that was my follow-up to Chris.
I'm so glad you went back to that, because that's a brilliant challenge that I'm going to accept, because I think I model well, but I am really bad at sharing what's happening behind the curtain of my facade when I'm doing it. And so I'm absolutely at jeopardy for doing exactly what you said. So I appreciate you going back, because that's a great challenge for me. I'm glad you went there. If you're running a business, I've got something for you. Whether you're running System and Soul, another framework, or you've been listening for a while and you know you need to be doing something. You have spreadsheets everywhere with different priorities, different objectives, different to-dos, an org chart somewhere. It's messy, it's hard to track, and it gets abandoned over time. We know because we've seen it and we've been there. That's why we've created S2 Sync. It's all-in-one app for your business, from communicating the big picture all the way down to the actions that your team needs to take and the things they need to focus on. We're going to give you a customizable platform to track, store, and collaborate with your teams as you implement your business framework. So never miss a beat. Inside S2 app, you can build out your long-term vision in the S2 roadmap. You can track weekly and monthly KPIs for your team and individual members on your custom scoreboard. You can organize and outline quarterly objectives with all of the important details, assign ongoing actions, keep a list of your important obstacles, opportunities, and updates you need to discuss in your weekly sync team meetings, and so much more. You can access your free trial of the S2 app today. Just go to s2sync.com. That's S2, the number, SYNC.com.
All right. So consistent leadership narrative is our next one. Here's what I mean by that. I worked for the leadership division of a small boutique consulting firm for a number of years. And we had a very large client, $4 billion. Well, I guess it depends on your definition of large. I think $4 billion is a pretty decent size organization. And they asked us to help them with leadership development. And by my observation, they kind of opened the door and said, go ahead. And I thought that was odd. I thought that was interesting, that they weren't poking and prodding around. Now, perhaps I could have taken that as the sign of ultimate compliment, that they were just so confident in what we were doing. But the truth is, I could have said anything. What leadership story am I going to say here today? Is it going to be, how sound is it going to be? How good is it going to be? And we see a different version of that in organizations that don't have a consistent leadership narrative. What is the story that I am being told to learn about leadership? And most of the time, the answer is, it depends on the person I'm reporting to. Who am I reporting to? Now, they're unlikely to say, 180 degrees, totally wrong direction. But when you have kind of not really the same story going on in an organization, it's very tough to create organizational momentum in the direction of truth and consistency and accuracy. And do you really want to look throughout the middle management ranks of your organization where your future executives are going to be? And do you really want to look at that and say, well, I hope they're reporting to the right person. I hope that they happen to get the luck of the draw of somebody who really knows their stuff. And I don't think we want that as organizations. I think we want to be more I would think we want to have more precision and more consistency. And so this is one of the soapboxes I get on, which is to say, I believe that every organization should have a consistent leadership narrative. Now we can debate about what goes in that narrative. We can debate what it looks like. We can debate the truth that should be or shouldn't be in there. But I think every organization should have one so that from your very first leadership opportunity until you become CEO, the general arc of narrative about leadership is consistent so that when I get promoted from from the assistant department manager to department manager, we're not going to start over and start over the leadership story. We're just going to say the narrative has been consistent. You know the principles of leadership. We've been sharing them here for a decade. Now let's talk about how do they get applied contextually a little bit different in a department manager position than in your assistant department manager. And now our elevation of our learning is about context, not about the principles, and we're not starting over. And the whole idea of organic leadership development that happens at the water cooler, when we're back at water coolers, but so at the water cooler, in the side meeting, we're not starting over, we're not getting a new flavor. We have a consistency that we can depend on. I think ultimately that is the key to the most efficient kind of leadership development organizations, where that story, that narrative doesn't change from leader to leader to leader.
So Chris has been doing these workshops for years, teaching management. So I bet he's got some ideas, but I want to know from you, Tim, like some context. Like if it's your organization and you have these leadership principles to create this consistent narrative, what are your top 3 or 4 for example, and giving us some hints here, but what goes on that document in your mind? What are some of the types of things?
Well, in the work that we do, our consistent leadership narrative is called the leadership tree. And because we believe the tree is a wonderful example of a leader, because every single tree that you look at on planet Earth is a little bit different, but they're all made up of the same parts. You've got roots, you've got trunks, you've got trees, and then I suppose you've got either needles or leaves. But the point is there's a root system for every single tree. And so if you ask for 4 pieces, I would say there's 2 key pieces in the roots, and we've mentioned them here already, inwardly sound and others focused. The roots are the who of leadership, and they feed everything else that happens. When you go up above ground into the pieces of the tree that we can visually see, I think you could generally take the things that leaders do and put them into 2 very broad buckets. They focus the organization and they fuel its people. And we could get into the 5 pieces of focus and the 3 pieces of fuel, but without kind of getting too much into the weeds there, I think that those are the 4 things. And then surrounding those 4 things is this word that I brought up a moment ago, is context. Let's make sure that we understand context. And the reason I think that's so important is because, let me use the military for an example. There are a lot of great leadership lessons to be learned from the military. However, I have yet to have a day in my career when I army crawled with live ammunition over my head into the office, because that literal battle perspective is not the environment in which I'm leading. And so how do we separate the 2 becomes really important. How do we separate the principle from its context so that we can hold on to the principle, but then make adjustments based on the context? So if it's focus and fueling people are what leaders do, if inwardly sound and others focused are who leaders are, surrounding all of that is awareness of contextual application. That's what I would call, that's what we use with our clients as a consistent leadership narrative.
My gosh, Tim, I really think you could do this for a living.
Thank you, Benj. Thank you. That's helpful to know.
I mean, keep your options open, but you might be onto something. I don't even know what to ask you or to dive into that or conversate about, because it's so clear and so just rock solid. And it's one of those things you can't unhear. It's like, if I don't go create a consistent leadership narrative for my company after this conversation, I'm absolutely failing my organization.
Let me pose this, right? And Benj, you've seen this, and I'm sure Tim, you have too. Um, but when we're in the session room, usually there's going to be one or two that are pretty much closed off, and getting vulnerable is not in their vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
But they're a good leader. I mean, they're not a great leader yet, but they're a good leader, and I want to invest in them. But they're not willing to be vulnerable. How do I? I mean, that's human nature, right? None of us really want conflict. We seek harmony, right?
Yeah.
But not everybody's wired the same, clearly. And we know people who are a little buttoned up, hold their cards tight to the chest.
Yeah.
And 9 out of 10 times they'll say something. I don't see the value in this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they're afraid. They have fear.
Yeah.
How do you overcome that?
Well, there's no guarantee that you can. That's where that would start. My one of somebody that I take cues from that I just, especially in this particular question that you're asking, is Jim Collins. I love Jim Collins' response to people who didn't agree with his research, and he wasn't combative. He wasn't defensive. He just said, "Look, you can try anything that you want to. You can go a totally different route. I am just here to share with you what the research says. If you've got another thing that you want to try, absolutely go for it. That's totally your call. I'm just here's the numbers, here's where it came from, here's how we crunched it, here's how we've applied it with other clients, here's what they've done. I'm just sharing that with you, and you absolutely can ignore all of that. That's totally up to you." And he wasn't a jerk about it. He just said, "Look, that's what we're doing." And I think, take into account the experience that the two of you have had, and in terms of building system and soul, and really, frankly, if you think more specifically, why the soul part exists of system and soul, and how you've been nurturing that and seeing that, I would see potentially a similar opportunity for you to say to somebody, "Look, you don't have to get on board with this, but I am sharing with you what I've seen over the last 12 years. I am sharing with you, the pieces that are part of System and Soul that do have research and data behind them." You say, "Look, this is what I've seen." And if you're integrating some of our work with Who Not What, you can say, like, here's what this research says, and you can ignore all of that. And I've had clients who have just they've paid lip service to it. They've kind of pretended. One of the best examples I can think of is that a senior executive in a publicly traded, multi-billion-dollar multinational company, and this one executive was really smart. I remember the first day I was in the room with her, and oh my gosh, it was amazing. I'm like, this person is of a stunning intellect, a stunning intellect. I got a chance to work with that executive team for a number of years, and what I began to tell is that this person was willing to have great conversations in the moment, but the work that we were doing in between really wasn't getting done. The feedback that I was getting about the in between was pretty surface level, and we don't really do surface level work, so that I could tell. And then eventually there was an opportunity to do some one-on-one coaching, and I got a lot of head nods and a lot of yeses, and then the deeper work, the looking in the mirror, the personal investigation, it wouldn't happen. And then a very interesting thing happened as things began to change around that executive team, and it was time for the senior leader, the CEO, was going to be moving on. I had multiple people come to me privately on the side and say, "I know that she's a candidate, but if she gets into the seat, I'm out of here." And look, she wasn't a bad person. I really enjoyed her as a professional, but she was unwilling to walk the path. She was unwilling to go that next step. And her intellect was not going to overcome the reality of whether or not people wanted to follow her with their lives, with their vocations, with their energy. And so I would share a story like that and say, "Hey, it's totally up to any one of you." And maybe you're just at a time of life where this work is too difficult for whatever reason. To which I would say, all right, we'll check it out a year from now, or check it out. I mean, I know when you're in a session, you can't really excuse them. I get that, but I'm saying, I feel like sometimes we have to, with courage and compassion, put the truth in front of people as winsomely as we can, and not think bad thoughts about them if they choose to walk away or not engage, and just know that people always have choice. That's hard to say because I want great leadership for everybody. I want great leadership for every organization. I know it impacts our lives, but that's my thoughts on whether or not people want to engage.
Yeah, I'm working with clients who struggle with that. The ones that want to work through it, which is a good sign. I'm like, listen, well, there's a lot of responsibility here at this level, no doubt. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that all eyes are on you guys. As you go, so go they. Mm-hmm. So we just keep that in mind. And if you're not ready today, I kind of do the same thing. I say, that's okay. It's a personal thing. Mm-hmm. But I just hope that you work on it. Because your direct reports are looking for your leadership.
Well, and think about this, what we were just talking about a second ago, inconsistent leadership narrative. What if in your organization, part of the consistent leadership narrative is that we're going to work to be leaders who are inwardly sound? Now, when that person chooses not to participate, and that is the culture and perspective on leadership we have, it really stands out. If we don't have a consistent leadership narrative that has inwardly sound, then it almost feels like a matter of opinion, potato. I mean, you can bring the research and say, but the organization hasn't adopted it at that point. It's easier for a senior leader to walk away from it at that point, but not if we have a consistent leadership narrative for the entire organization.
Hey, podcast listeners, System and Soul Coach Bill Green here. I'd like to share an S2 tip with you today as I work with clients to help them gain clarity and control. Today's tip is designed to help you get into a strong weekly sync cadence right out of the gate. Schedule a virtual call as soon as possible after your first weekly sync meeting coming out of your Clarity Day 1 session. There will likely be some loose ends or questions around the foundational tools. Have the S2 coach model the virtual session as an actual weekly sync meeting. From the check-in through the cadence of scoreboard, objectives, and actions from day 1, opportunities and obstacles will arise. Drop those items to the opportunities list and lead a DAT session to address them together. Be sure to leave time at the end to commit and conclude and rate the meeting. While the concept of a weekly sync meeting seems simple enough, executing on it, especially if great meetings haven't been your thing, can be challenging at first. Modeling the simplicity of the weekly sync early will lead to mastery. Hope this helps you, and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Tim, for the sake of time, let's head straight into that third one. Go first.
All right, go first. Interestingly, this has a strong connection into courage. It also has a strong connection on the others focus side of things in humility. And I just encourage leaders that when it comes to finding fault in process, in a circumstance, go first. Find your contribution first. Find the place, the thing. Now, maybe it's not the thing you did. Maybe it's the thing you omitted. Maybe it's the thing you should have done that you didn't do. And maybe you would say, how could I have possibly known that ahead of time? Well, maybe you couldn't have, but now you know. And now you can look back and say, okay, now if I had had that lesson 2 years ago, then that would have been the right thing to do. But I find that if in most cases, it's not 100%, but in most cases, when leaders choose to go first, courageously own their contribution to problems or challenges or outcomes that weren't what they wanted ideally, most of the time, the other people in the room will follow suit. It's really interesting what happens when we own our piece first. And now the person to the right of me says, well, let me see what I contributed to this that I could have done better. And the person to the left says, well, let me see what I contributed. The net reality, if we do this over and over again, consistently, and make it the part of the way in which we troubleshoot, the way in which we make things better, we become that rare but precious reality that nearly every organization is after, is we become a fast learning organization, because it's not about the whole blame process. It's not about how do I avoid that. It's like, okay, I own my piece, you own your piece, we own our piece. Now let's solve it. Now let's make it better. It's not about pinning somebody against the wall or getting rid of them or whatever the case may be. I'm saying if we as leaders can practice courage and practice humility in going first and owning it, and the book and the kind of I think the person that says this just about as well as anybody is Jocko Willink in Extreme Ownership. It's the first chapter of the book. I personally think it's the best chapter in the book. It's really clear to say, it's very much it's the buck stops with me, and we as leaders, no matter what happens, we've made a contribution. I mean, I've got some moments in my own life where I was like, I didn't make any contribution. 6 months later, I was like, oh yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. It took me, my humility wasn't there. My anger on somebody else got in the way, whatever. It took me a little while, but there's always something that I could have done better. So I encourage leaders to set the pace, set the example, courageously with humility, going first and owning their contributions.
You set the context for that so well, because there was a hot minute where everybody was talking about celebrating failures as like a cultural norm. I'm like, I just don't think that's quite it. Like, I know what they were trying to do, but the idea of celebrating failures, just always sat funny with me. But this frames the solution a lot more advantageously for the organization. I love that. Tim, you are a bit of a legend in our world because you've been around before we even got to know you, got to talk to you, but it's been a pleasure. And I'm hoping that you can be a regular as you continue to learn and hone your craft, and as we continue to steal all of your insights and integrate them into System and Soul.
I think we do a series with Tim Spiker. That's what we should do.
It'll be like a regular hey, we can do whatever we want because we're starting season 5 right now. So
hey, listen, I'm going first. I know that.
Yeah, all right.
Well, hey, Ben, what I want to say to both of you gentlemen is that I really am excited about how you are bringing the organizational soul and the system execution to be alongside this who-based work. I think it's so important because sometimes people can look at me and look at the research that I share and talk about that, and because I don't get deeply into the systems side of things, they can kind of dismiss it a little bit. They can say, oh, wait, no. I mean, it's really, now I draw them back to say, here's the connection between who you are and execution. And we show that all the time, but I really appreciate how the two of you are integrating all of this together to bring the biggest bundle of value and truth to people that really helps them across the board. So I appreciate the nice words you're saying to me, but I really appreciate where you guys are going and what you're doing.
And likewise, we don't do that deep, heavy lifting work with the one-on-one stuff. So tell everybody where they can find out more about Tim Spiker, and we'll make sure that the links to your book are in the show notes.
Thanks. I mean, the easiest place is beworthfollowing.com. Beworthfollowing.com.
Heck yeah. All right, man, there's nobody that's listening that's not inspired and probably has homework, so let's all go do it, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris.